Catherine Wright is our host for this session and will be prompting conversation rather than interviewing people. If you don't know anything about the REC, as we call the Religious Education Council when we're trying to say it quickly, it is an organisation bringing together around 60 different members, faith and belief groups, professional organisations, teachers' associations, higher education organisations, and other stakeholders, all of whom are committed to bringing high quality religious education to every child and young person in our schools. So we're all committed to that. We work together and we have a great deal of strength within that large organisation. I'm not going to say any more, but I'm going to hand over to Catherine to start getting us into the substance of this conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody today. For those of you that don't know me, I am a board member of the RE Council, but my day job is as Chief Executive of Culham St Gabriel's Trust. And I'm really pleased that we're going to be talking about personal worldviews. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our panel, which I'll be chairing this afternoon. But I just wanted to give a very brief context as to why we're talking about this now. And we're talking about it now in particular, I think anyway, because it sits within the context of a developing religion and worldviews approach to religious education. For those of you who are not already aware, back in May, this publication came out, Religion and Worldviews Approach in Religious Education in England. And personal worldviews are referred to here in this particular handbook. But I just want to set this in a slightly wider context and the whole notion of worldviews in itself. The Religion and Worldviews approach looks at worldviews in three different ways: as objects of study, as part of how we study them, and as part of the experience of those doing the study. And the term personal worldview sits within that context. And each of our panelists who are going to share their thoughts on this are going to be explaining how they see that from their particular perspective. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Emma Salter, who until recently was working at the University of Huddersfield, a researcher in this field, and has been undertaking research particularly about personal worldviews. Then we're going to be hearing after Emma from Dawn Cox, who everyone seems to be until recently was a full-time teacher in the classroom, but still engaged very much with what's going on the ground in the classroom with teachers, but increasingly doing advisory work and so on around this. And I'm sure it's known to many of you for her blogging around religious education and most particularly recently around personal worldviews. And lastly, but by no means least, and I don't think I need to say, well, actually, I suppose you were until recently, the Deputy Chair of the RE Council, so everyone gets say until recently, Deputy Chair of the RE Council of England and Wales, but also works particularly across the South West as an advisor for religious education. Ed is going to be our third speaker. So just to explain a little bit about the format of the session this afternoon, Emma, then Dawn, and then Ed are going to share their thoughts and their perspectives on personal worldviews for roughly about sort of 10 minutes each. And we'll just literally move from one person to another. After that, I've asked each of them to ask a question of one of the other panelists based on their presentation. And then after that, we will be opening things to the floor for you to ask questions or to make a comment if you would prefer. And to do that, we would just like you to pop into the chat questions that you have. It would be really helpful to me chairing this session if you can just put the word question or just a big capital Q at the start of what you put so that I can easily find the questions, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of buzz and other comments in the chat along the way as well. And do the same thing if you want to make a comment publicly, if you want to share something, then please, again, just put the word question, but then then just say that you would like to share something. And if you can give us an idea of what you want to share in the chat, that would be really helpful to us as well. I'm expected to be really busy. There's already almost about 60 people in this space. So apologies in advance if we don't get to all the questions. Okay. We might not be able to do that depending on how many there are. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emma to share her thoughts on personal worldviews. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Catherine. Welcome everyone to this REC webinar. It's lovely to see you all. So I'm going to speak about a research project on personal knowledge in RE that I'm leading. So first of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to All Saints Educational Trust who are funding the project. And secondly, to acknowledge co-investigators and project supporters. So this includes NatRe, RE Hubs leaders, Deborah Weston, Claire Clinton, Martha Shaw, Chris Bale, and everyone across the RE professional community who supported the project through interviews, focus groups, filling in the national survey that went out at the front end of the year. And it's really important to acknowledge this aspect of collaboration because working with RE professionals really is at the heart of this research project, which is reflected in the project title, Personal Knowledge in RE by Teachers for Teachers. And I'm using that word teachers as quite an inclusive term to include anyone who's professionally involved in RE. But as we know, teachers mainly are at the chalk face of this. So a key aim of the project is to collect data from across the RE community to gain a better understanding of ways in which personal knowledge is understood by RE professionals and implications for teaching, learning and inspection. And then to disseminate the research findings widely and accessibly across the RE community by the usual routes. So hopefully this will benefit RE professionals through supporting their decision making for teaching, learning, curriculum design, and also for preparing for inspection, etc., etc. So thinking about the term personal knowledge, it feels like a very deep concept term. It potentially contains layers of meaning and interpretation. So if you take just a moment to reflect on the word or the concept personal, what does that invoke for us? Maybe something individual, something private, interior, one's interior self. Maybe it's about identity, ego, or existentialism. No doubt other ideas will occur to you. Culture might influence how personal is interpreted depending on whether individualism or communitarianism is more dominant in a community or a society. Knowledge, the concept or the word knowledge is another deep concept word. We can think of different types of knowledge, theoretical, empirical, practical. What about legitimacy of knowledge? What knowledge is allowed to whom and when? Hegemony, who has power and control over knowledge? What about praxis, knowledge in action? What to do with knowledge once it's been gained? So if we think about this term, personal knowledge, those two loaded concept words put together, it seems to be a very busy term loaded with meaning and interpretation and potentially complex for RE professionals to navigate through these many variables of formal education. However, if we turn our attention to the Ofsted 2021 research review, we see that this report gives a more focused explanation of personal knowledge that is specifically within the context of RE. And here are a few key points, which I am paraphrasing from that 2021 Ofsted research review. So the report links personal knowledge with pupils' positionality, and it acknowledges that positionality is informed by many, many different factors. It links PK or talks about PK being about pupils' being aware of their assumptions and their assumptions about religion and non-religion. It states that pupils are not obligated to change their minds, and also that personal knowledge ought not be assessed. It says unencumbered by assessment. However, that Ofsted report does state quite clearly that personal knowledge must be explicitly connected to RE substantive and disciplinary knowledge. So to me, and this is where I'm bringing in my personal opinion just for a moment, and then I'll move on to the research findings. To me, Ofsted's account of personal knowledge feels more like critical reflection. To me, as an educator, this is what I think, this is sort of how I would understand critical reflection. So after learning about a topic, has my understanding changed? If so, how and why? And in what ways are my current knowledge significant? I mean, arguably, critical reflection is a form of personal knowledge because it asks me to reflect on and rationalise my relationship with knowledge that I have learned. But I think that here we meet something like a branch in the road, maybe, depending on teachers' own educational philosophies. So we might engage with the philosophical complexity of personal knowledge as that big, busy, loaded concept, or we might stick to Ofsted's 2021 more kind of specific explanation that personal knowledge must relate specifically and directly to RE substantive and disciplinary knowledge in the RE curriculum, and that teaching supports and enables pupils to reflect on their relationship with knowledge that they've learned within the RE curriculum. Now, I'm raising these points because within the personal knowledge in RE project that I've been leading, these different sorts of approaches and understandings of personal knowledge are starting to show in the data collected in the project. And this is kind of my main point now for this particular bit of presentation. So arguably, PK, personal knowledge, as a form of required knowledge stipulated by Ofsted, arguably throws teachers a prompt to consider their own philosophy of and for education. So that's really the main kind of line I'm throwing out here for us to consider. And I've got a few examples from the data from the project to help us think this through. I'll talk about 2 or 3 depending on when I get timed out. I'm using focus group data from the project to exemplify this point. So just a tiny little background about our method and methodology. RE Hubs leaders, thank you RE Hubs leaders, conducted between them 23 focus groups across 122 participants across the broad areas of the RE Hubs regions in England, and we had a wide spectrum of RE professionals that participated in those focus groups across early years, primary, secondary. So a broad spectrum of participants. And so these few examples I'm going to just flag quickly now. What you need to imagine is that these are RE professionals who are in a facilitated way having conversations about personal knowledge, and I've had a look at that data that was fed back to me and selected a few sort of nuggets for us to think about. One example comes from incorporating personal knowledge in teaching and learning. So some of the focus group participants really expressed concerns about providing absolute definitions of personal knowledge, fearing this would be overly reductive and would result maybe in PK becoming a box-ticking exercise. So we might say that for this category of teachers, personal knowledge actually was not a burden at all within the curriculum, but actually they appreciated the leverage it allowed them for encouraging their pupils to deep thinking and reflection. Other participants commented that linking pupils' own positionality to topics made the teaching relevant and current, which in turn benefited pupil engagement. So we might conclude that these teachers really value pupils' intellectual investment in their learning. A second example from the focus group data links to pupil agency. And what we saw looking at a lot of data came in, what we saw looking through all that data, that terms such as pupil voice, pupil expression, and pupil agency were recurrent. Pupils were given permission to have their own opinion. Pupils were encouraged to express opinion, their own opinion. But at the same time, pupils are taught how to draw on substantive and disciplinary knowledge to evidence and rationalise their opinion. So underscoring the point that opinion is grounded in knowledge, and also that it's okay to change our mind about things. So this part of the data gives us clues about the philosophies of education of these participants, and that their philosophies of education focus not just on the substantive knowledge, but also on drawing on substantive knowledge for the development of skills of personal reflection. And then my last example for this presentation is around self-identity and relation with others. So through the focus group data, personal knowledge was often linked to empowering pupils to investigate their own developing self-identity and giving them the courage and the space to do this, to develop pupils' self-awareness of how they relate not just to themselves, but to others. And this was often through potentially exposing pupils to the limitations of their understanding of others. Okay, so this bit of data maybe suggests that for these participants, an aim of education as contributing to identity development and awareness of self-identity in relation to others. So to sum up, just a tiny little sliver of data from the project. It's a big project, there's lots of data. This is just a tiny little snapshot. But just one point that I wanted to suggest for tonight's webinar is that it might be said to show that as teachers reflect on personal knowledge as part of one of the triad of knowledge stipulated by Ofsted and how this is sort of woven through the curriculum, those teachers are also reflecting on their own personal, professional, educational philosophies and values. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, very much indeed. Fascinating. I just want to know more about the research as well. Thank you. There are some questions already, which Emma, you might want to just have a look at, but we're not going to answer those yet. I've made a note of them because we're going to move on and hear from Dawn next, who I think, well, I'm anticipating may not present exactly the same perspective, but another really interesting one. So thank you, Dawn.
Okay, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see some slides. Can you see that, Catherine?
Yeah, I can see that. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to speak. I'm really privileged to be able to share some of my thoughts. And this very much is my thoughts. I will be talking about what some other people have said about personal worldviews. I apologise in advance if I've misinterpreted or misrepresent those views. But I want to look at personal worldviews and personal knowledge very much from a kind of a classroom perspective. So having a look at what I think it is, but also what implications that has for us as RE teachers. So I'm going to start with a definition. So I think that a personal worldview is the way in which we see things. It is our assumptions, our presuppositions, our attitudes, our thought processes, our values, our prejudices. And all of them have come through a variety of influences throughout our own lives. This could also be referred to as positionality, and reflecting on and building an awareness of these is personal knowledge. Ruth Flanagan calls this worldview consciousness, and I think that's quite a nice phrase to use to understand personal knowledge, that we become conscious of that worldview. It's individual and formed through our life experience. No one has the exact same personal worldview, but there are elements that might connect with others, formally or informally. It's not your worldview against my worldview. The intersection between each of our worldviews is complex, and RE involves considering where they may overlap or when they don't and why. Our worldviews are not fixed and they're continually developing. I think that things like reading, going to new places, traveling, meeting new people can have a significant impact on people's personal worldviews. So, as teachers, we need to consider that there are students that may not have those opportunities. So, students who don't get to travel, to go to new places, meet new people, and their reading might be limited to their school reading, and therefore their opportunities are limited. In RE, we have the opportunity to expose the students to the content that they might either align with their worldview partially, or it might challenge their own worldview. This is why it's important to consider what we select to teach to our students. There is no end goal. Becoming aware of your own worldview is important for now, but it is a continuous process. I have just read this book. There's two front, oh, can't really see, it's blurring. There are two front pages. I think maybe the US one is on the slides and the UK version is here. Some of you might have read this. Thank you to whoever recommended it to me. I've just read this book where I've discovered that I am weird. Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic. The book is absolutely fascinating. In reading this book, I have understood my own worldview more, and it's helped me to increase my understanding of other people's worldviews. It's really a recommended read. This has reiterated to me the importance of learning as part of the process of personal knowledge. If we give students rich content, then there will be opportunities for them to reflect on it. Just as I've read this book and it gave me rich content and I've reflected on it. As a teacher, I'm not particularly interested in finding out a student's personal worldview, although many happily share this in class. They generally make it clear through their comments, their questions and reactions to what I teach them. However, what we can do is highlight to students where they have made these assumptions, these presuppositions, where their values are coming into their learning and where they've looked through their own lens and not thought about others. In fact, it's when they give these honest responses to the content, oh, miss, what are you talking about? How could they? That sort of responses that actually helps us with our teaching and to plan our teaching for the future. I think, as Ofsted have said here, that we should identify clearly the content that will help our students to reflect on their personal worldviews, but also to teach students what worldviews are as part of this worldview consciousness. Learning rich content gives them the opportunity to reflect on how their personal worldview may have changed, albeit in a tiny way. Learning what a personal worldview is and how we might reflect on it helps students to think critically about themselves and about others. However, I don't think that we should solely choose content for our curriculums with the intention of challenging personal worldviews. It reminds me of a style of RE that some of you might have heard of, is shock jock RE, where teachers are deliberately presenting controversial issues to students in order to get reaction, and that material challenges their worldview so starkly that the aim is to engage them. I think that is a misuse of trying to use students' personal worldviews in content choices. I think that we should consider in our curriculum for our students where there might be opportunities to reflect. This might come from content that challenges their personal worldview and their thinking. An example of this that I frequently see in class is when looking at polygamy, and the book has some really great analysis of views on polygamy. Up until fairly recently, I've taken the weird point of view that polygamy is wrong and monogamy is right. However, I've now realised that this worldview came from three things: the British law that polygamy is illegal, a Christian-centric upbringing where it's one man and one woman, and the assumption that marriage is about love and therefore one person. I essentially was viewing polygamy through a monogamy lens. Now I've realised this, I can then think about those who practice polygamy and that they're not using a monogamy lens to make that decision about polygamy. And therefore, I hadn't considered the different factors that contributed to their worldview. Now I've read about them and I understand them, my worldview has shifted through this increased knowledge. And through this, it's changed how I teach it and how I respond to student comments. This is an example of reflexivity, as it's the encounter with knowledge that's transformed my thinking and my teaching. This also shows that our own personal worldviews will have an impact on how we teach, the language we use, how we explain things. We need to be aware that our own personal worldview as teachers matters. Hammercheck claims that consciously we teach what we know, unconsciously we teach who we are. So I have made a tool that some of you might have seen. I was really lucky to attend the Edgehill Summer School for a couple of years in a row, and this was from 2 years ago. And I was thinking about worldviews and how we could support teachers in thinking about them more. So I've created a kind of tool. It's freely available. The link is there, and I can share that. And the kind of aim was to help teachers actually of all subjects to reflect on how worldviews might impact themselves, because it impacts our teaching, but also how that might apply with our teaching. That there's kind of set of different activities that teachers can do. If you're interested, you might even want to have a go at some of them yourself to think, it's a tool to help people to think. So I was really lucky to be able to go to the summer school to have time to think and time to do reading about personal worldviews to be able to produce that. Emma mentioned the Ofsted research review talking about that personal knowledge should be unencumbered by assessment. I agree with this comment. However, I want to take a moment to think about what we mean by assessment when we're talking about personal knowledge by using two examples from my teaching. Last week, I had the privilege of teaching in a Muslim faith school, which I've never done before. Knowing that most, if not all, the students have some form of Muslim worldview helped me with my planning. I don't mean it changed the content of what I was teaching, but I think that it helped me to think about how they might think about what I'm going to teach them. It helped how I explained things to them and how I responded to their questions. I assessed their personal worldview in my teaching. That didn't require me writing the reports or giving them grades, but it was an assessment of how their personal worldview might impact how they understand what I'm teaching them. So I made continuous assessments of those students' thinking before I even met them, but also whilst I was teaching them. My second example is with a Year 7 class. Some of you might have seen me talk about this before, getting students to think about what things influence their own personal worldview and giving them a blank lens once we've talked about these ideas, and for them to reflect on which things that might have influenced their own personal worldview. But when I first did this, I had a bit of a shock, because there were some students who couldn't do what I asked them to do, not because they didn't understand what I was asking them to do. They knew that they wanted me to label this, but that step of reflecting on an abstract concept was too challenging for them, aged 11. I assessed this in the classroom. I could see that the step that I was asking them to make to reflect on their personal worldview was a step too far. But I assessed them in a qualitative manner by thinking, and in one case, speaking to an LSA and saying, look, that student's not going to be able to do this now because they've made it clear to me. I've assessed from their comments to me that they cannot think in this way. I didn't give them a grade. I didn't put it in a mark book. However, I did assess where they are in their development of personal knowledge, and they couldn't think about the influences. So this might be controversial. I have made this up. I started thinking about how personal knowledge might develop over time. So first of all, so you can kind of see that time learning graph. So first of all, people say, well, it's not just about having opinions, but I think one of the foundations of a personal worldview is opinions. So my 3-year-old great niece has got opinions. She's got opinions on what she wants for her tea. That might develop in her realizing that actually other people have opinions as well. So that's a development. Then there's going to be a realization that actually these opinions aren't fixed. as being right or wrong necessarily, and the understanding that just because she thinks that she should have something and somebody doesn't, it doesn't have to be that hers is the right way. Then I think that we can get to the step where people can realise that you have this personal worldview, and I don't think everybody does realise this, recognising that it changes. The activity I was trying to get them to do was to identify the factors that would influence that personal worldview, recognising that your own personal worldview affects how you or others approach things. So I think that that top bit becomes the personal knowledge, that worldview consciousness. So there is kind of like a development. And so opinions aren't worldviews as such, but they are part of that development. And then, of course, and in the tool that I share, there is the unknown. You know, there are things that we don't know about our own personal worldview. I'm going to be honest with you, I hadn't really thought about that polygamy, me looking through the monogamy lens until I read that. So they're the unknown things as well. So the children that we teach are in a stage of their lives where, whilst they have a personal worldview, it's quite a big ask to get them to be reflective, as an adult may or may not be. Asking students to share or reflect on their personal worldview in a lesson may not be something that they can do easily. I think we need to think carefully about what we get students to do and to write about in class. However, what we present to students and the questions that we ask them can help with this reflexivity. I, in a recent blog that Catherine referenced, have written some suggestions. Now, I've divided it in primary, secondary, but I don't actually think it's like that because I had year sevens that struggled with some of this kind of developed understanding. But in my blog or via that link are some possible questions that you might think about asking students to help them reflect on the personal knowledge. And it kind of goes up to sixth form where it is much more kind of developed and nuanced questioning. I'm happy to have any feedback or any suggestions on that document. So finally, I think that understanding personal worldviews and personal knowledge is not just the domain of RE. Whether a student is in PE or art or science, the role of reflecting on their personal worldview and positionality is crucial to understanding. However, I do think that RE can contribute hugely by teaching students what these things are so that they can go on to think about them and apply them in other subjects and beyond. And in my reading, I thought that this was a great kind of way to think about it. And that's me done.
Thanks so much, Dawn. I was just reading the quote as you finished there. Thank you so much. Really interesting. Obviously, completely different kind of perspective from what Emma was sharing, which is the joy of this kind of panel this afternoon. I think that it gets us thinking in so many different ways. So, Ed, over to you to give a third perspective on all of this now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen. Is that visible? Right, cool.
That's good, Ed. Thank you.
So look, thanks so much for inviting me. It's really, I've got lots of questions actually already. It really, I took part in Emma's research earlier in the year, and then I led her research with some of my Learn, Teach, Lead local network hub leaders, and it was great. It's really challenging actually. I felt that it was something I knew about, but actually when I sat as a research participant with Emma, it was really interesting, Emma, you leading us through the research process and thinking about the optionality and making sure that we were happy with what to contribute, and just thinking through, I don't know, it was really interesting being in that context. And then I led that with some other hub leaders, and I found it very interesting actually, realizing that actually we don't all share the same understanding about this at all, and have very different practices. So it's vital. And of course, there's a real difference, and Bill's mentioned this in the chat. There's a difference between personal knowledge and personal worldview. And I'm going to say a little bit about that in a minute. But I noticed that the lovely title here, Space for the Personal. So, actually, it's not really, we're fleshing this out, aren't we? So I want to start with something really practical. I'm the advisor to I'm Ed Pawson. I'm the advisor to a number of SACRAs, amongst other things. I led a SACRA meeting yesterday, and I led one last week to a different SACRA. And in those two SACRAs, I feedback on officers' reports, and these two comments have hit me between the eyes recently from summer reports, two separate schools. Actually, they happen to be in the same trust, but I don't know if that's linked. The inspectors are entirely different people, I checked. But now I know that discussion isn't what we're talking about exactly, but actually I'm really interested in teasing out how we get to personal knowledge, and there has to be something about a sharing. Now, the reason why this is worrying me, and we had a really interesting conversation yesterday in one SACRA meeting about what is going on in secondary schools in particular. So first school, these were both from May-June inspections this year. First one, the inspector says pupils rarely discuss the issues they learn about, so they do not deepen their understanding. And then second school, however, pupils often lack confidence to share their views. Across the curriculum, there are limited opportunities for pupils to discuss and debate ideas. This hinders pupils' ability to demonstrate their learning with confidence. Now, I think I'm really interested to tease out exactly how we're developing this, and I really like Dawn's ideas about how she's doing this in the classroom. But what the schools were saying to me yesterday is we don't have time. We cannot do this because there are too many other things that we're told to do. And we've got this default to knowledge, which they consider to be essentially is about substantive knowledge. So here is something. This is what I'm putting forward essentially. I'm observing that a renewed focus, and I say renewed, and I'll explain why in a minute, which takes pupils' personal worldview seriously and considers how to enable them to develop their personal knowledge and connectedness, makes the subject more inclusive and more engaging. Problem. The knowledge orientation currently being experienced in schools, especially secondary, is often detrimental to pupils' interactions, discussion, reflection, and spiritual development. Now, I've added the phrase spiritual development in there deliberately because I had a really interesting conversation with Joyce Miller earlier, who was one of the commissioners on the RE Commission. And she feels quite strongly that actually the Commission made recommendations, and it was that they recommended that spiritual development was really looked at again. And I think we've lost this to an extent because we've focused a lot on the development of religion and worldviews as a curriculum focus. So anyway, and I think these are linked because what are pupils' worldviews if they're not linking them to their own understanding of their own spirituality? So we've made reference to the National Statement of Entitlement, which features in the Religion and Worldviews Handbook. And we can see clearly that we've got content, engagement, and position. And a really clear element of the Religion and Worldviews Handbook is to say that position in these two senses, in J and K, are significant elements of a rounded curriculum. So that means that as well as the subject content and as well as thinking about the ways of knowing and how we actually go about the learning, pupils need to be given the opportunity to reflect on and potentially develop their personal worldviews and to reflect on how their personal worldviews affect their learning. So clearly part of the handbook approach, which is being widely drawn into the way that curricula are being and syllabuses are being developed, is significant. I'm really interested to see the way that Julian Georgiou took this further in the framework that she developed along with her colleagues, and really interested to see the people focus of the way RE is developing, because we've got people in both these two approaches. So Gillian took the handbook with her group of RE experts and said, look, actually, let's develop some principles out of this. The idea that worldviews start with people, therefore it is personal in a sense. It's not distant and objective and essentialized and separate. So it's about people, but in particular, context of saying that people's ability to make sense of what they learn is integral. So how do people make sense of what they're learning if they're just being delivered to, if it's just content being delivered to them? This took me right back to 2001 and to the Devon syllabus, which I really used to like. With these two focuses, and it's interesting to reflect on how RE has moved on, or in a sense gone backwards, I would say, because I'm wondering where the room for the right-hand side is in many schools, given that actually a lot of secondary teachers in particular are telling me they don't have time. I talked to a MAT leader across a trust recently, and she told me that she'd sent out some lessons, or they'd planned some lessons on assisted dying to be taught in non-examined RE. So in non-examined RE, they're teaching about assisted dying. She went to observe 7 lessons, and in every single one of those, the teacher just got the pupils to make notes about passive and active euthanasia. They didn't discuss in any of those lessons. Now, how have we so disempowered our teachers that what was commonplace to me teaching in 2001, which was that the right-hand part of that has to be given and should be given and is fulfilling in giving the opportunity for pupils to contribute to the learning to contribute to pupils and students' formation of their own beliefs and values. Now, those are really key elements of how we understand RE in my head, but actually I'm seeing that actually we've gone backwards in this sense, that teachers aren't giving their pupils time because they can't. They don't feel they've got the opportunities. So drawing down a little bit now on a workshop that Trevor Cooling delivered at RE Exchange, I want to think about Trevor talked about knowledge in RE, and he talked about a shift in focus from information transmission to reflexive dialogue and making sound judgments. Now, I'm seeing a sort of RE in a move to Religion and Worldviews approach, which I like the sound of. But actually, the information transmission part of this, I think that has really come into our schools in the last 10 years, 12, 13, 14 years. This is a Michael Gove, Nick Gibb approach to education, which we're seeing dominating. And I fear that just in my example that I gave about a MAT where the teachers are really just trying to transmit information, we really need to look at how this subject helps pupils develop not just their knowledge in the substantive context, but in how they understand their own lives. Now, just a quick comment about that. I don't think many of us can claim to have many hundreds of light bulb moments in our lives. I had a light bulb moment in when I was about 20, and I was in an education lecture at university, and I was learning a lot of topics which I really had no knowledge about. I was doing an engineering degree at that time, and I couldn't really conceptualize what these were about. I had an education lecture, and it talked about the way in which real learning actually has to connect with something we already understand. It has to connect with our worldview or the sense of who we are in our own connected cognitive conceptual space. And some of the learning I was doing, I realized why I wasn't learning well, because I was only learning in this abstract space that I had no connection with. Now, I think so I was in a context where there was information transmission going on, but actually I had this light bulb moment. I can still picture where I was and how it appeared to me, because it made sense of why I was finding it so hard to learn the stuff I was being told, because I couldn't connect it to anywhere I was. Now, again, I'm back to Trevor Cooling now, and Trevor really talked recently in this lecture at RE Exchange about Michael Polanyi and this idea of what he calls tacit knowledge. And I've been away and looked a bit at Michael Polanyi, and I'm really excited by the way that he, in his approach, challenges what he calls the impersonal objectivist interpretations. He talks about science, but we could be talking about learning. And he talks about the way in which the scientist's personal participation and knowledge is indispensable, and that even in the exact sciences, knowing is an art of which the skill of the knower is guided by their personal commitment. So we've got to be able to reinterpret this way in which, learning cannot be just about substantive knowledge. There has to be space for other sorts of knowledge, or the skills of other skills going on here. And I'm indebted to Richard Quay in the 2021 RE Research Review, a common theme in all our presentations here, which pushes personal knowledge to the fore here, or as an important element. Where this also takes me to is Warwick University and Bob Jackson. I had the absolute pleasure of introducing Eleanor Nesbitt, who was Bob's colleague at Warwick, to a meeting last Saturday, and to talking in depth with her about the RE Commission and with ideas coming out of Warwick. And in Rethinking Religious Education and Plurality, Bob says this: the interpretive approach rejects the idea that it should be common. Should be the common school's goal to induct children into a particular religious worldview. Well, of course. The aim is rather to help children and young people to find their own positions within the key debates about religious polarity. And he explains further that the dialogical approaches to learning, the content of RE is not simply data provided by teachers, but includes the knowledge and experience of the participants and an interactive relationship between the two. So we find their key ideas which fed into the core report, probably through Eleanor, but also through other people. So back to Trevor's talk about knowledge in religious education, knowledge and worldviews. So he pictures this, and I like the interrelationship here. Our personal worldview is the filter through which we experience and interpret the information we receive, and thereby generate our personal knowledge of the world. So an interaction between personal worldviews and the way that helps us develop personal knowledge, which after all is that connected knowledge which is going to help our young people become rounded adults in a complex world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. Gosh, my brain is very full from having listened to all three of you. And as I said earlier, we're going to come back first of all. India, I wonder if you're able to also spotlight Emma and Dawn as well. Would be great. Because first of all, I'm going to ask Emma to see if she has a question for Ed or for Dawn as we start off.
Just one.
Or it could be both of them if you prefer.
Well, thank you, colleagues, and also colleagues in the chat. There's such a lot going on here. And as always happens in these situations, lots of tendrils, I think, are happening. I've got a real choice of questions, I think, to ask. However, I'm going to sort of throw this one open, which is going back to basics a little bit. Maybe back to basics isn't the best way of stating it. We're using two different terms. We're using personal knowledge and we're using personal worldview. I think this is the first meeting I've been at when those two terms have been used in what seems to be a conflated space. So I think I want to just check in with colleagues. Are we using personal knowledge and personal worldview synonymously? Are we using them or are they separate things, subtly different? Is there a risk that we could conflate them by accident by not paying attention?
That's a great question. I think that also was brought up maybe by Bill in the chat as well, and it was going to be my question as well.
Ed volunteered to put his head on the block.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in. I think we're at, and I've heard people saying, well, what Ofsted mean by personal knowledge is actually very different to what other people mean by personal knowledge. So, it's not even conflating two terms, is it? Actually, I mean, that's why I finished with Trevor's slide there, which wants to say that our personal worldviews are a filter, which we develop through our experience. Um, and that guides us to the development of our personal knowledge. Now, what actually is personal knowledge as different to just knowledge? I mean, how is my knowledge my personal knowledge? Um, I think there are lots of questions here, and that's why that's why I quite liked. I actually quite liked the title, which just said the personal. That's why I started with that slide actually, because I like the fact there was ambiguity because I don't know if we're there yet. And that was going to be my question back to you, Emma, to say, well, your research was specifically about personal knowledge, but actually we have been using this term personal worldview a lot, and it clearly seems to mean something slightly different, but there's an overlap. So I think this is why it's vital that we're doing this because I'm not clear.
Thanks, Ed. Dawn,
Can I
you
add
did
in?
touch on this a little
Yeah,
bit, didn't you? I think in your
yeah. I think
what you shared.
maybe using that analogy of the magnifying glass and that what I get the students to do. So the magnifying glass and the things around it are kind of representing your worldview and the things that have influenced it. Recognizing that that exists, I think that worldview consciousness is the personal knowledge. I don't think I would worry about teaching the children that as such. These terms, personal worldview, yes, I did, but not about personal knowledge. But the fact that they could reflect, most of them, on that personal worldview and the things that influenced it, I would say is that they had that personal knowledge, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I said I wouldn't say too much, but now I'm tempted to say something now. Um, so my understanding would be that everyone has a personal worldview. Okay, I think to me that seems like a kind of given. We all have a personal worldview. What I really liked, Dawn, about you sharing, I think it was Ruth Flanagan, I think you said had used the term worldview consciousness. I found that really helpful. As well. And I had read a little bit about that previously. To me, kind of my personal knowledge is when I intentionally think about how I have formed my personal worldview. When I'm actually thinking about that, when I'm reflecting upon it, thinking about the impact that that might have. If you like, it's when I pick up that lens for me that I'm then looking through and intentionally considering that. But to be quite honest, you might, but I do not do that every day, every moment of the day. I'm not constantly thinking, oh, I need to take I need to look through my personal worldview lens today. I mean, to be fair, in our jobs, we probably do that, maybe more than some other people, I might want to suggest. But it's not something that I necessarily consciously or intentionally do. And for me, it's doing that is about my personal knowledge. That's how I'm kind of understanding it, I think. Dawn, do you have a question for Emma and or Ed?
I've got questions for both, but I think I'm going to pass it back to Emma. So, how useful do you think it would be for there to be kind of a set definition for the RE community of what personal knowledge or a personal worldview and personal knowledge is, but also what it's not? Do you think that would be useful for the community?
Okay. I'll speak to personal knowledge first because I've probably got a clearer sense of that. Personal worldview, I might sort of fluff my way around that a little bit. And it's a good question to lead on from the previous part of the conversation. Martha Shaw at London South Bank and I've been sort of conducting literature review in support of the project, and this terminology, personal knowledge, is very broad, and we found it situated in lots of different kinds of disciplines. for example, it's used quite a lot in medicine and nursing in particular to distinguish maybe between kind of the quantitative, positivistic medical diagnostic stuff and how a patient's feeling, what's their personal knowledge about their condition. We also saw it quite a lot in tech, interestingly. So I think that the terminology personal knowledge clearly has some kind of broad, slightly ambiguous meaning, but then when we put that within specific disciplines, it becomes more pertinent to the requirements of that specific discipline. I think that rereading Ofsted 2021, I know I've read that a few times now, and going back to it with respect to the data we're collecting from the project and looking at it again, I think that Ofsted is fairly clear about requirements. It might not be that clear about definitions, and I know your question about definitions, and I will come to it, but I think it is pretty clear about requirement of what, in Ofsted world, Ofsted is expecting of pupils expressing personal knowledge, or what personal knowledge is. So I think that, what they're looking for is fairly clear. I can hear teachers jumping up and down screaming or disagreeing with me, but in terms of an actual definition, and this came up in the project findings, there was the fear that if we have a uniform and absolute definition, that definition has to be created by someone and belong to someone. So there's sort of like a power dynamic and a top-down thing going on there. And also it could be quite restrictive. So I think it's one of those terms where understanding, just from the point of view of Ofsted I'm talking about now, understanding requirement is quite important. But having a very restricted definition potentially could be quite limiting. I don't know, Dawn, if that answered you sufficiently.
Yeah, I think there will be teachers who want to have a definition, but I think it is complex, as you say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emma and Dawn. And we might come back to it in a little while, because Tim's just added a question again about, it was kind of about definitions in a way, and whether and how useful it is to have kind of distinctions and definitions for teachers. So we might revisit that later. But Ed, did you have a question for Dawn and or Emma?
Well, my question's to both of them. I suppose perhaps a bit more to Dawn than Emma, because I'm thinking about schools, and Emma is perhaps at Dawn's. I want to explore whether there is a bias against personal knowledge, because I just find, that a lot of teachers want to do it and find they can't, for all sorts of reasons, and I just find that really sad. And I mean, this has been my experience through a career as well, of wanting to do it more than I felt able. And yet we feel it's so important. Well, I think, yeah. So, and is there a bias?
Is that I think there has been maybe a small shift away from getting students to give opinions. And I think there's that link, as I said, between opinions and personal worldviews. So I think that maybe, for example, in the GCSE, if you compare the old specification pre this one, it's directly asked the students, what do you think? It doesn't do that anymore. And I wonder if that shift has made people think, well, actually, you're not going to be asked your view. So actually, we don't need to hear your views, and you don't need to necessarily think about them. And I wonder if people have kind of thought about that. And also, I think people have kind of mentioned this in the chat. When you ask students to engage with it, you are at risk of them presenting views that are offensive, illegal, a variety of things. And I think that some teachers, especially if they're not teachers with specialism, might feel worried about doing that. So the best thing is to not sort of ask or engage with it. It's to present the information, because that's there on the slides they've been given. Whereas conducting a conversation, a reasoned conversation, is actually really, really tricky. So I think that might be some causes.
Thanks.
I'm going to say a quick word. Within the data we've collected from teachers in the wider RE community, there was a very, very strong consensus that personal knowledge is really important, and for all kinds of different sorts of reasons, some of which I touched on really briefly in my presentation, whether that's engagement with learning. So actually it's sort of underpinning and making the substantive knowledge just a bit more interesting and engaging, all the way through to those sort of more personal development elements. The point, Ed, that you made in your session about curriculum being overweighted and competing demands in the curriculum, meaning that, you know, there's just too much to do, and so some things fall by the wayside. That also was repeated within the research data. But also teachers did come up with a number of innovative ways of weaving sort of personal knowledge through the substantive learning as well. But certainly it was thought to be really important. We didn't have any responses that went, you know, another thing to do kind of thing. They all said it was core.
Thanks ever so much. We've got 2 minutes left. Any final personal reflections maybe at this point? Or any thing you've learned that's going to impact on your personal knowledge? Ed?
Can I just say that I found it really helpful. I think, Emma, you earlier talked about the phrase being used in medical contexts. And I really get that idea of sitting in a bed and having stuff done to me, and the medics coming in and there being lists of drugs I'm on and so on. But what's my personal knowledge of where I am? I've picked up some of the terms from the medics and so on. But what do I understand? What's happening to me? And that could be it could be really inaccurate. It could be way on a scale because I'm anxious or whatever. And I think that's really interesting. There's an objective reality of the medical treatment, but there's also my perception, which if the medics aren't taking that seriously, they're not treating me as an individual. I find that useful.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Dawn, any final reflections?
Yeah, I think just to say for teachers, you know, I've been teaching 24 years. And this is only a recent kind of focus. I'm sure we've been doing these sorts of things anyway, but for people not to be scared by the language and, you know, definitions and things like this, because it's evolving and people will start to share ideas and share what it might look like in the classroom. And it's a process. It's not kind of something that we've got to do now and you're going to be inspected on it. And if not, you're going to fail. It's something that we can work together in the community on.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. Emma?
Just to say thank you to the fantastic RE community, and aren't we good at continuing to think things through and continuing to be reflective and continuing to make it all dynamic with the aim of delivering the best teaching that we can in our circumstances. So thanks for rocking up, guys.
Thanks, Emma. And I just want to end with a quote, which some of you would have heard me probably refer to a number of times, but for me, I think it's just reminded me of this quote again as we're talking this afternoon with one another about this idea of kind of hospitable approach, which was what my own sort of research was around. And I use this quote, which is by a Protestant theologian called Miroslav Volf, from 1995, and his context, just so we can place it in a context as well, and perhaps understand a tiniest bit about his worldview. He's a Croatian theologian, and he was talking particularly after Yugoslavia had split up into the different countries and so on. And so he was speaking into that particular context as a Croatian theologian. And I was going to read this quote because for me, I think it's really powerful in terms of thinking about how our own worldviews interact with other people's. And then I will finish. So what he says is, in an embrace, I open my arms to create space in myself for the other. Open arms are a sign that I do not want to be myself only, an invitation for the other to come in and feel at home with me. In an embrace, I also close my arms around the other. Closed arms are a sign that I want the other to become part of me, while at the same time I maintain my own identity. By becoming part of me, the other enriches me. In a mutual embrace, none remains the same because each enriches the other, yet both remain true to their genuine selves. I just think this is such a powerful way of thinking about, for me, what we're about when we're in our RE classrooms. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, RE Council, for hosting, and may the conversation continue beyond today. Thank you.